Hello and welcome to my Games Design AV essay. In this video I'll be going over the key features of games and how they play a part in the finished product. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy. Terrain is the layout and main features of a video game's world. For example, grassy plains or tall mountains are variations of terrain. The type of terrain varies depending on the setting of your game. The terrain is designed to fit the theme of the game. Different games have different terrain. For example, Far Cry 5 will be set in a fictional country with lots of mountains and forests. However, games such as Spider-Man's terrain is very different, as it's set in New York City, so it has a lot of flat land and tall buildings. The characters have different methods of traversing the terrain. In Spider-Man, the main way of travelling through the terrain is by web slinging. The terrain is designed to complement this feature, as it uses tall buildings to allow you to swing around the city. Terrain is important as it can set the scene for a game, and it can also help utilise the mechanics of the game, such as Spider-Man's web slinging. Architecture is used in games to develop structures and buildings. A good example of this would be the Assassin's Creed games, where there are grand areas of Roman buildings varying from small houses to massive colosseums. These can be used to help create a sense of scale, or to house side missions or other quests for an open world game. Architecture can be interacted with in ways varying from opening doors and windows to demolishing entire buildings, such as in the Just Cause series, where bases can be liberated and destroyed. Architecture is important as it gives the world more depth and can sometimes be used to add more to the game's story, such as side missions, as well as to keep the player immersed in the game, and to give the sense that this is a real, well-established world. Objects also play a big part in the world. Objects can be interacted with to cause events to occur in the world. A good example of this would be in Spider-Man, where different items can be picked up and used to damage enemies. Objects can be pulled over in order to confuse enemies when doing stealth missions. These make the gameplay much more detailed, as it provides many more ways to approach a situation, such as confusing enemies to attack with stealth, or using these objects with force to attack the enemies head on. Objects are important as they allow for a more in-depth approach to situations and provide the player with lots of different pathways they can take to handle a mission. A character is what you normally play as within a game. They come in lots of different shapes and sizes. Some characters have incredibly complex and in-depth story arcs, such as the characters from Detroit Become Human, for example Connor, whereas other characters such as Mario are much simpler, and they don't have too much of an in-depth story. The function of these characters vary. In Detroit Become Human, you choose the character's path, and the game is heavily based on the character's interactions with other characters and NPCs, and they serve the purpose of creating an immersive story. Mario, on the other hand, has a much simpler function of providing the player with a way of traversing the levels within the game. Mario games usually have a very basic story, with no real character arcs or development, which means the character is utilised more as a tool to get through each level, rather than a complex and in-depth character. Some games focus heavily on character customization, such as GTA 5 Online and Skyrim. These games allow you to change the appearance of your character, and to feel much more in control of the game world as you play as someone or something that you've designed. This normally doesn't have too big of an impact on gameplay. However, choosing different races in games such as Skyrim can impact the abilities you possess or the interactions with NPCs that occur. Characters are very important to games, no matter how they are used. If the character is used for a complex story arc, they are important to create an immersive, intriguing story. If the character is used as a tool to progress through the levels, they're important as they allow the player to take advantage of the mechanics and specific skills. NPCs, or non-player characters, can also be just as important as playable characters. NPCs can be sometimes dormant, more background characters, or they can be heavily utilised to make a very interesting story. A good example of this is Undertale. There is a diverse range of NPCs, all which are very unique, and they feel like well fleshed out characters with personal traits, habits, and other things any well-developed character would have. The purpose of NPCs is to drive the story forward, whether that's in minor or major ways. In Undertale, the interactions your player has with the characters changes depending on your previous actions in the game. These can be major or minor changes. A good example of this is in the 3 types of routes in the game: the pacifist route, the neutral route, and the genocide route. An interaction with Sans, one of the NPCs, towards the end of the game changes depending on the route you've taken, and the amount of monsters you have killed. If you've killed no monsters, the interaction is a warm goodbye from the character. This is vastly different to if you've killed every monster you encounter, which will initiate a battle between you and Sans. If the only monster you kill happens to be Sans' brother, Papyrus, he comments on this. This shows that NPCs can also have well-established feelings and backstory. A feedback interface is how the game gives you information on what's happening. A good example of this is the Call of Duty franchise. The feedback from the games are displayed around your screen, such as the map, the score of the game, the health, and the kill feed, etc. The purpose of this is to allow the player to know exactly what's going on around them, and to point them in the right direction of objectives and checkpoints. Another example of a good feedback interface would be Overwatch. This shows your health, the objective, the abilities, ammo, and the kill feed. A good interface would be well designed, simplified, and would have a clear visual style to ensure that it doesn't disrupt the gameplay. There are a variety of different perspectives in games, and these all affect the gameplay and the visual style of the games. In 2D games, The character is always on screen, and can switch from a fixed camera to a moving one. This perspective restricts the player's field of view, as they can't see what lies ahead of them in levels. A simple UI is normally used for this kind of perspective, as often games with this perspective have more of a focus on platforming than complex health or collectible features that other games might focus on. A good example of this is Rayman Legends, where the camera alternates between fixed and moving for your different platforming sections. The game has a separate background from the foreground, which gives it a sense of depth. The UI is simple but effective, showing only the character you play as and the amount of items you have collected. The visual style of a 3D game is very different to a 2D one. The world is constructed in a three-dimensional environment, allowing the character to traverse this in a variety of ways. In 3D platformers, the character is commonly kept in the centre of the screen, allowing you to know exactly where you stand in the environment, making it easier to platform through the level. The style of these worlds depends on the game setting and the genre of the games. For example, in Super Mario Galaxy, which is a game based in space, floating platforms and spherical planets are used. The fact that this is a 3D game allows for the spherical planets to be much more diverse and have explorable areas that wouldn't be accessible if this was only in a two-dimensional environment. First-person games show you the environment through the character's point of view. This makes the experience much more immersive as you feel like you are the character and you connect with them in that sense. The visual style of this changes, however, as you commonly can't see your own character in these games, just the world through their eyes. The UI in first-person games is often much more complex than those of 2D or 3D platformers, as you must know things such as the direction you are facing, where you are on the map, etc. These kind of perspectives are often found in shooter games such as the Call of Duty series. In these games, you need to know which direction an enemy is shooting you from to allow you to react, which may not be necessary in a third-person game, where you can clearly see the direction of an enemy. In third-person games, much of the surroundings are visible to the player, allowing for a simpler UI. You can clearly see where the character is always located, which makes the perspective more suited towards platformer games. The world moves around the player as they traverse the environments. The 3D Mario games do a great job of making a game with a third-person perspective. It gives you a clear visual indication on where you are in the map and how to progress through the level. Scrolling games are mainly 2D games that keeps the character that you progress as in the centre of the screen and having the map move around them. A good example of this would be the classic Sonic games, as well as the newer release, Sonic Mania, where you scroll left and right as you control Sonic, who stays constantly in the centre of the screen. A game that uses aerial perspective would be a tycoon game such as The Sims. In these games, you often control a world rather than a character. You play as an omnipresence, where you control the world around you. Games such as Resident Evil use a context-sensitive camera, where you can only see different things depending on the position in your game. This would make it so the player could only see what the developer wanted them to, which added suspense to the game, which is why it's more suited towards the horror genre. FMV, or full motion video, is normally used in cutscenes in order to drive the story along. These cutscenes are pre-rendered videos with enhanced graphics to give key story elements. In older games, such as Sonic 06, the full motion videos were much more graphically advanced compared to the actual gameplay. However, in more modern games, the full motion videos are barely different to the actual gameplay, due to advances in graphics and hardware. This allows developers to have seamless transitions between full motion video and gameplay, like in the opening of Spider-Man PS4. Interaction models are a big part of how you play a game. In most games, you control an avatar. The avatar that you control when in the game is a single character that you play as. This immerses the player on a character's journey, and over the story they begin to build a connection with this character, as you experience the same thing as these characters. A game where you control your avatar would be the early Assassin's Creed games, where you played as Ezio in the Italian Renaissance. You follow the character through 3 games, becoming emotionally invested in his story. In some games, such as Skyrim, you can customize the way your character looks, which allows you to be more invested in the character's story, as you feel as though you had an impact on the creation of them, and they really are your character. An omnipresence, however, is where the player controls multiple characters, or sometimes the world around them. A common type of game to embody this would be tycoon games, such as Zoo Tycoon and The Sims. In these games, you don't strictly control a character or avatar, but you control the whole world and what happens in it. For example, in The Sims, you can build a house, create characters that interact with each other, but you don't strictly control any of these characters. You build a world for these characters to live in. Sure, you can have an influence on what the character's life and their choices, but you don't specifically play as them. Single and multiplayer games are often very different, and they play differently to each other. Single player games are often more story based, and they have clear end goals and objectives, whereas multiplayer games are often player versus player shooter or strategy games. A single player game's narrative can vary, sometimes taking a sandbox approach, which is where you as the player have much more freedom in how you approach the game's story and how you progress through the levels. A game that uses the sandbox approach is Minecraft, as you can approach the end goal of defeating the Ender Dragon in almost any way you can imagine. A linear narrative, however, gives you one linear path to the end game. The 3D Sonic games use this style of narrative, giving you a clear path that you need to follow in order to get to the final boss and beat the game. These games normally have linear level designs and much less freedom in the way you approach them. Multiplayer games, on the other hand, have much different features to single player games. They use things called lobbies to allow players across the world to connect and play against each other. Lobbies can contain anywhere from 2 people, like in Portal 2's multiplayer, where you work together to use the portal mechanics to traverse the stages, up to 100 people, like in Fortnite, where you fight against one another in a large world to be the last man standing. Loadouts are often found in multiplayer games, like first-person shooters such as Call of Duty, where you can customize the weapons and perks you've used to fight against your opponents. The Call of Duty series uses both single and multiplayer modes, and combines elements from both. For example, the multiplayer mode of Call of Duty uses maps and weapons from the single-player version of the game, allowing players to fight against each other with the weapons and the maps that they've grown to love in the single-player mode. The multiplayer mode does have exclusive items in order to differentiate itself from the single-player mode though, such as exclusive weapons, maps, and the inclusion of the perk feature. Perks give you different abilities in multiplayer matches, such as being able to constantly sprint, or being able to pick up an enemy's ammo to replenish your guns. These make multiplayer more defined as a separate game mode, rather than just elements ripped straight from the single-player mode. There are 2 main types of narratives in video games: embedded and emergent. An embedded narrative is a story that has a predetermined ending before the player has any input. The way the player progresses through these levels doesn't affect the narrative at all, although some games mimic the feeling that you have control. For example, the Walking Dead series is all about choices. You must make tough decisions in order to progress through the game. These choices make you feel like you're impacting the narrative, but in truth, the game ends the same however you play it, to move on to the next episode. An example of this is when you have the option to either kill or spare a character. If you kill them, the game progresses from there. If you spare them, they later die in the same episode, therefore making these games have an embedded narrative. The story in an emergent narrative is determined by the actions of the player, and does not have a predetermined ending. A good example of this are games like Age of Empires, where you have full creative control on how the game should progress, and has no clear storyline. The game progresses depending on the empire you've created and the strategy you've chosen. At a push, Minecraft could be considered an emergent narrative, as there is no real storyline. There is a final boss, but the game doesn't end there, and can be continued for as long as you want, with full control over how it progresses. Settings have a big part in modern video games. The physical setting is where the player is and what is around them. This setting can have big effects on gameplay. For example, if you're climbing a steep mountain, the game will play out much differently to when you're walking through an open plain. A good example of this is Minecraft. In Minecraft, you can go from climbing fast mountains to walking through grassy fields, and how you play varies as a result of this. When climbing a mountain, you play much more carefully and slowly, rather than the fast, jumpy movements when you're traversing through a plain. The temporal setting is the parts of the setting that indicates the time period the game's set in. For example, in Destiny 2, the game is set many years into the future, which allows you to take advantage of futuristic technology, such as spaceship and jetpacks, as well as futuristic weapons. This changed how the game is played, as it plays very differently to a shooter that would be set in the modern day, as these more modern settings would not have advanced mechanics like jetpacks, which future games often use. Environmental settings of a game can affect gameplay by changing things such as the weather. For example, in games such as the Forza series, the weather can affect the way the car controls, and therefore affects the way you play the game. In rainy conditions, the car will be more slippery on the road than if the road was dry. This also applies in other games, such as Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. When it begins to rain, it becomes more difficult to climb steep hills, as you slip back down. The setting can have a big impact on the player's emotion. A great example of game settings that cause emotion are horror games. The settings in horror games can fill the player with fear and suspense. For example, the farm section of Outlast. In this section of the game, you're surrounded by people looking for you in a cornfield, and you have to do your best to stay hidden. Same applies to the Five Nights at Freddy's series, where you're alone in a dark pizza restaurant after hours surrounded by animatronics. You see the map through fuzzy security cameras, making it harder to see, and adding to the sense of fear and suspense, as it limits your senses. Ethical gameplay relates to when games challenge people's more ethical and moral views. Games like this tend to attract a lot of media coverage, as they go against what people think is right. A good example of this is a certain level from Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. The level is titled No Russian, in which the player must gun down a large group of civilians at an airport, in order to gain the trust of a terrorist group that you're inspecting undercover. This was the most graphic scene of the game, as civilians could be heard screaming, and the injured would crawl away, leaving a trail of blood. This was considered very unethical by the media, and was even banned in some countries. Goals, challenges and rewards are what gives a game purpose, especially in multiplayer games. A good example of this is Fortnite Battle Royale. In Fortnite there are 3 main goals: to reach tier 100 in the current season of the Battle Pass, to reach level 100 in the current season, or to win a game. You get EXP rewards when you win games, and when you reach the maximum tier of the Battle Pass, you get rewarded with cosmetic skins and items that can be used in the game. You reach tier 100 by completing challenges and gain experience by playing games. These challenges give you different ways of playing the game, and reward you for doing so. They often give the game a lot more replay value, especially when paired with good rewards. Rewards in Fortnite vary from skins and other cosmetics, to music or virtual currency. This gives the player a reason to complete the Battle Pass, and therefore, a reason to consistently play the game. Oh my god! In games, there are many various ways of controlling what happens. The player commonly controls a character in most games. However, it is also seen where the player controls an object, or nothing at all. An example of controlling a character in games applies to most AAA titles, such as Mario and Sonic. This is where you control a physical character, either to progress through a story, or to traverse platforming levels. In other games, such as Geometry Dash, you can control a small object that has no story, and is only used to traverse the hard platforming auto-scrolling levels. A game where you control nothing is something like Candy Crush, where there is nothing to control, it is simply a puzzle game. Another type of control where you control nothing can be virtual reality, because you can control yourself. Looking around and moving your hands is what controls the game, not an avatar or a character. The key mechanics of games include things such as the inventory, scoring, and the win condition of the games. In games, the inventory is where the player's items, such as weaponry, is kept, and it allows players to carry multiple items at once. A game that heavily utilises the inventory system is Minecraft, as it is where everything you need to build and survive in your own world is kept. Scoring is a big part of competitive multiplayer games, as it dictates which team will win the game. This is used in almost all games, however Overwatch makes it very apparent that scoring is one of the most important mechanics of the game. There are a variety of different game modes, such as Payload, Capture Point, and Control Point, all with different scoring mechanics. In Payload, the team to push the objective further through the map will take the point. However, in Control Point, the enemy team must take control of the point for a certain amount of time, and when that time limit is reached, they will take this point. Win conditions is what is done to beat the game. For example, beating a final boss is a win condition in many linear titles. However, lots of games do not end where the final boss is beat. There are still side missions and other collectibles to find. For example, getting 500 moons in Super Mario Odyssey will allow you access to a new kingdom, the darker side of the moon, in which you'll face against one last level with no checkpoints and challenging platforming throughout. This level takes advantage of all the captures in the game, and really pushes your ability. Therefore, when the player beats the level, they are shown one last conversation between Cappy and Mario, as they finish the game once and for all. To explain game structure, I'm going to use the example of Spider-Man PS4, which is structured in a linear way, but has branches coming from its structure. The main story quest of the game is very linear. You start, get a level you need to tackle next, and then play through said level. This continues like this for the rest of the game. However, between each of these levels, you have to navigate the map to get to the location, and on the way to these locations, you come across side quests that you can do to level up your character and gain additional collectibles that can unlock things such as different suits for you to wear in the game. There are also scheduled breaks in the levels to allow the player to tackle these side quests, which helps the player feel more immersed with the game, as not only they are handling the big fights, but also being the friendly neighbourhood Spider-Man that everyone knows and loves. Addiction is a common topic in games, and is often used by developers to add more replay value to their games. Often in RPG games, leveling up starts off incredibly quick, and killing simple enemies will grant you lots of XP. But as you get to a higher level, the amount of XP needed to level up increases, making it more difficult to level up, and pushing the player to spend more hours on the game. Daily rewards are also often used, where if you log in for a certain amount of days in a row, you will receive a variety of rewards. A good example of this is Fortnite's Save the World mode, where logging in daily can earn you items such as weapons or even in-game currency. Resource decay is often seen in faction or competitive games, where your power will decrease over time if you do not log into the game, either resulting in you in becoming weaker or being lowered in the ranks. And that's it. Thank you for watching this video. On the screen will be a list of credits and the songs and external footage that I used to create this video, and a big thanks to the creator of these for helping me. I hope you enjoyed and have a good day.